The wind didn't just howl, it screamed. It tore through the valley like a predator, clawing at the cracks in Christine Nelson's tiny cabin, whispering secrets she'd spent years trying to forget. The storm had been brewing all day, a suffocating pressure against the old wood, and now it was trying to get in. Christine sat at the table, the surface worn smooth by years of worry, a letter clutched in her hand. The paper was soft, the ink blurred. She'd read it so many times the words were burned into her mind. It was from Janet, her younger sister. "Christine, my final tuition is due. If I don't pay, I'll have to come home. I don't want to be a burden, but—" Christine placed the letter on the table, her jaw set like stone. There was no money. She'd sold off most of the cattle. The land itself felt tired, beaten down by too many harsh winters. The bank's patience was a rope stretched to its breaking point. Janet was so close to a life that wasn't this. A life that wasn't a constant struggle, a daily grind just to keep your head above water. A life that wasn't stuck. She squeezed her eyes shut, pressing her fingers to her temples. She had to find a way. She had to. And then, a knock at the door. Not a polite rap, but a heavy thud that seemed to shake the whole cabin. Christine wasn't a woman who startled easily, but when she pulled the door open, the freezing air rushing in, she almost slammed it shut again. Because he was there. Warren Tyler. He stood in the swirling snow as if he were part of the storm itself, tall and broad-shouldered, a ghost from a life she'd locked away. His coat was white with snow, his hat pulled low, but she'd know those eyes anywhere. Steady. Gray. The kind of eyes a woman could build a life around. The kind of eyes she had once trusted with everything she had. The kind she'd spent 5 years trying to burn from her memory. Her hand tightened on the doorframe until her knuckles were white. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice as cold and sharp as the wind. Warren didn't even flinch. He looked at her as if he'd expected nothing less. "Figured you'd say that." She kept her face a hard, unreadable mask, her spine ramrod straight. "If you came here looking for forgiveness, you're digging in barren ground." For a long moment, the only sound was the shrieking of the wind. He just watched her, his gray eyes seeming to measure the 5 years of bitterness and silence that stood between them. Finally, he let out a slow breath, a plume of white in the frigid air. "I didn't come for that," he said, his voice low and rough. "I came to see if you need help." A sound escaped her lips, short and sharp and utterly without humor. It might have been a laugh on a different day, in a different life. "Help?" she repeated, the word tasting like poison. "From you?" The wind slammed against the door, trying to force its way between them, but Warren stood his ground. He was a mountain. He had always been a mountain. "I know things have been hard," he said, and the way he said it, it wasn't pity. It was a fact. He said it like he knew, like he'd been watching from a distance, just as she, against her will, had sometimes found herself watching for him on the horizon. Something twisted in her chest, a painful, familiar ache she despised. "You should go," she said, her voice perfectly steady. He held her gaze for one more heartbeat, then gave a slow, reluctant nod. He tipped his hat and stepped back, letting the storm begin to reclaim him. But just before he turned away, he stopped. "You don't have to do this alone," he said, his words nearly stolen by the wind. And then he was gone, a dark shape swallowed by the white chaos. Christine stood there watching the empty space where he had been, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She told herself she wasn't shaking. She told herself she wasn't wishing he had stayed. She told herself a lot of things, and none of them were true. Warren Tyler was back, and the storm raging outside was nothing compared to the one he had just unleashed inside her. The heavy thud of the door shutting echoed the slam of a cell door. Christine leaned against it, her eyes closed, the wood cold against her back. She could still feel his presence on the other side, a lingering warmth against the biting cold. The cabin walls rattled, but the true tremor was deep inside her bones. She pushed herself away from the door and moved back to the table, but Janet's letter was just paper and ink now. Her mind had been hijacked, dragged backward against its will, to a time before the silence, before the accusations, before the world had cracked straight down the middle. It was summer then. The sky was a vast, impossible blue, and the tall grass of the meadow flowed like a green river in the wind. The world felt new, like it was still being made. She was 10 years old, barefoot and wild, her laughter trailing behind her as she ran through the grass, the sun warm on her skin. And behind her, always behind her, was Warren. "Come on, Christine," he'd called, his grin flashing. "You're getting slow." She'd spun around, kicking up a cloud of dust, her hands on her hips. "Or maybe you're just getting faster." He smirked, his gray eyes sparkling with mischief. "Or maybe I always let you win before." She gasped, a perfect imitation of outrage. But before she could retort, he lunged. She shrieked, twisting away, but he was too quick. His fingers wrapped around her wrist, and they tumbled together into the soft grass, a heap of tangled limbs and breathless laughter. For a moment, they just lay there. The air smelled of wildflowers and warm earth. He was still holding her wrist, but his grip had softened, his thumb tracing small, absent-minded circles against her skin. And Christine felt her heartbeat stutter, just a little, just enough. It was the first time she'd ever looked at him and seen not just a friend, but something else, something more, something that made the air feel thin. Before she could put a name to it, she scrambled to her feet, brushing blades of grass from her dress, refusing to meet his eyes. "We should get back," she'd said, her voice suddenly too loud. "Pa will be waiting." Warren watched her for a beat, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded. All right. They never spoke of it. But it was there. A tiny seed planted in the silence between them. Years spun by. The childhood games changed, softened, became something else. Warren wasn't just the boy from the meadow anymore. He was a constant, a quiet strength, the one person who understood the parts of her she never showed to anyone else. One evening, when she was 17, they met at Willow Springs, their place. The water was like dark glass under the twilight sky. "You ever think about leaving?" Warren asked, skipping a stone across the surface, watching the ripples spread. Christine hugged her arms to her chest. "Sometimes." "Where would you go?" She hesitated, the truth a fragile thing in her throat. "I don't know. Somewhere. Easier." He turned his head, and in the fading light she couldn't read his expression. "You wouldn't leave alone, would you?" The air between them suddenly felt thick, heavy with all the words they'd never said. He reached out, not to grab her, but just a whisper-light touch, his fingers brushing against hers. And for one terrifying second, Christine almost leaned into him, almost gave in. But she'd seen what happened to women who lost themselves in a man's promises. She had sworn it would never be her. She pulled her hand away and forced a smirk, tossing a stone into the water with a sharp flick of her wrist. "Race you back to the horses." Warren was silent for a long moment. Then a quiet laugh escaped him. "All right," he said, "race you back." And just like that, the moment was gone. Christine blinked, the memory dissolving like smoke. The storm outside hadn't let up. It hammered at the walls, demanding entry, trying to drag the ghosts in with it. She clenched her jaw, shaking her head. She had made the right choice. She had kept her feet on the ground. She hadn't let herself fall. And yet, she glanced back at the door. For the first time in 5 years, Warren Tyler had been on her porch. And she had sent him away, just like she always did. But this time was different, because some ghosts don't stay buried. And some storms you can't just shut the door on, they follow you inside. The storm passed by morning, leaving the world hushed and buried under a thick blanket of pristine snow. It looked peaceful, untouched, as if the night and the ghost it had brought had never happened. But Christine knew better. Some storms don't break things on the outside, they rearrange everything on the inside. She rode toward town, her mind a restless hornet's nest. She told herself she was just getting supplies, checking on an order at the general store. But that was a lie. The truth was, the cabin had felt too small, too quiet, filled with the echo of his voice. She needed to escape her own thoughts. But thoughts have a way of following you. The bell above the door of the general store gave a soft jingle as she stepped inside, shaking the snow from her coat. The air smelled of milled flour, leather, and stale tobacco. She wasn't 2 steps in before she heard it. His name. Tyler was seen up by Cedar Creek last night. Christine froze, her back to the counter where 2 men were talking in low, rumbling voices. She recognized them immediately. Arlie Tullinger, a man whose tongue was sharper than his wits, and Scotty Heath, an old sheep herder who'd seen more winters than anyone else in the valley. Arlie shook his head, a smirk playing on his thin lips. Damn fool! Coming back here after all this time. If it was me, I'd have kept on running. Scotty let out a long, slow breath, his gaze distant. Some folks say he didn't do it. Arlie scoffed, a nasty, grating sound. Oh, yeah? And what do you think? The old sheep herder was quiet for a moment, stroking his gray beard. I think a man carries his guilt in his shoulders, he said, his voice thoughtful. And Warren Tyler, he don't walk like a guilty man. Christine's jaw tightened. She reached out and grabbed a sack of flour, her knuckles brushing against the rough burlap. She didn't need to hear this. She'd heard it all before, for 5 long years. Warren's name, spoken in whispers, a curse on the town's lips, accused but never convicted, hated but never proven guilty. A man who had simply vanished before the truth, or the lie, could catch him for good. She slammed the flour sack onto the counter with more force than she intended. Old Mr. Haynes, the shopkeeper, barely looked up from his ledger. But Arlie had noticed her, and Arlie Tullinger never let an opportunity pass him by. Well, well, he drawled, his voice slick with insinuation as he ambled over. If it ain't Christine Nelson. She ignored him, focusing on the worn wood of the counter. Arlie's smirk widened. Bet you ain't too happy about seeing Tyler back in these parts, huh? Christine finally turned, her face a blank canvas, her eyes like chips of ice. I don't waste my time on ghosts, Arlie. He chuckled, crossing his wiry arms over his chest. No? Figured you'd be the first one in line calling for a rope. Her pulse hammered a little faster at her throat, but she refused to give him the satisfaction. She slid her coins across the counter, took her flour, and turned for the door. She just had to get out, get away from the whispers. But Arlie wasn't done with her. You know, he said, his voice dropping, becoming conspiratorial, you spend long enough hating a man, it starts to feel comfortable, like an old coat. But you take that away, and then what? What's left? She stopped. Her hand was on the door, the cold metal a shock against her skin. For a split second, she almost turned, almost let the rage she'd carried for so long finally boil over, almost asked the question that had been a tiny, treacherous flicker in the back of her mind since Warren had stood on her porch last night. But she didn't. She pushed the door open and walked out into the blinding white. Because she was terrified of the answer. The cold air was a physical blow, but she barely felt it. The words echoed in her head, refusing to be silenced. Some folks say he didn't do it. He don't walk like a guilty man. She should have ignored it. She should have let the past stay buried where she'd put it. But she couldn't. Because for 5 years, in all the time since her father's death, since Warren had disappeared, she had never once allowed herself to question the story everyone had agreed on, the story she had agreed on. And yet, last night, standing on her porch, he hadn't looked like a murderer. He had looked lost. He had looked at her like she was the only thing left in the world that made any sense. For the first time in 5 years, a tiny crack had appeared in the wall she'd built around her heart. A tiny crack of doubt. And Christine had spent a lifetime learning that once doubt gets in, it never, ever leaves. The sun was a pale wafer in the winter sky, casting long skeletal shadows across the snow as Christine rode out of town. She told herself she'd done the right thing, ignoring Arlie, refusing to be dragged into the mud. But the doubt was a second rider, silent and persistent, keeping pace with her horse. He don't walk like a guilty man. She urged her horse faster, as if she could outrun the thought. She had to focus on Janet, on the money, on survival. That was real. The past was just ghosts and whispers. And then, a voice sliced through the cold, quiet air. "Well now, look what we have here. Ain't the only one taking the long way home." Christine's hands clenched on the reins. She didn't have to turn around. She knew that slimy, insinuating voice anywhere. Arlie Tullinger. She pulled her horse to a halt as he stepped out from a copse of snow-dusted pines, that same insufferable smirk plastered on his face. He was a lean, shifty man, built like he'd spent his life dodging honest work. His eyes were small and clever, always calculating, always looking for an angle. Christine kept her expression impassive. "If you were waiting for me, Arlie, you've wasted a perfectly good afternoon." He chuckled, a dry, rustling sound, and stuffed his hands into the pockets of his thin coat. "Weren't waiting, just observing the scenery. But since fate has thrown us together, I might have a little proposition for you." Christine sighed, a plume of white vapor. "I highly doubt that." Arlie took a step closer, his horse shifting nervously behind him. He lowered his voice, as if sharing a dirty secret. "It's about Crow Baird." The name hit her like a punch to the gut. She kept her face a mask of stone, but Arlie saw the flicker in her eyes. His smirk widened. He knew he had her. "That's right," he said, his voice smooth as snake oil. "Heard he's holed up in Charcoal Cave. Hurt bad. Real bad. Took a bullet in a disagreement down south." Her stomach coiled into a tight, cold knot. Crow Baird. The name was a plague in this valley. A violent, unpredictable man with a reputation for leaving bodies in his wake. Arlie glanced around, a theatrical show of caution. "Now see, Crow's got himself a predicament. He's bleeding out, but he ain't ready to meet his maker just yet. He needs someone to patch him up. Someone quiet." He paused, letting the implication hang in the frozen air. "And he's sitting on a pile of money, more than enough to solve a certain sister's tuition problem." She didn't speak. She didn't have to. The truth was a lead weight in her chest. Janet's letter, the looming debts, the cold, hard fact that no miracle was coming. Arlie sidled closer, his voice dropping to a persuasive murmur. "I ain't saying you gotta like the man. Hell, you can curse him while you're stitching him up for all I care. But that money, Christine, that money could change everything for you." She hated him for it. She hated him because he was right. That money wouldn't just go a long way. It would solve everything. It would mean Janet could finish school. It would mean she could keep the ranch. It would mean survival. Her jaw tightened. She'd spent her life believing she was better than this, better than taking blood money from a man like Crow Baird. But what if she wasn't? A sudden gust of wind rattled the bare branches of the pines, and with it came a feeling, a presence. She felt him before she saw him, and then a voice, low and firm, cut through the air. "You don't want to do this, Christine." She spun in her saddle, her heart leaping into her throat. Warren. He was standing just beyond the trees, a silent sentinel against the snow. His coat was pulled tight, but it was his eyes that held her. They weren't angry. They were something far more dangerous. They were disappointed. Arlie let out a loud, theatrical groan. "Oh, for pity's sake, look who it is! The town ghost." Christine straightened her shoulders, her chin lifting in defiance. "What are you doing here, Warren?" He didn't look at Arlie. His gaze was locked on her. "Stopping you from making the biggest mistake of your life." A spark of her old anger flared. "I don't recall asking for your opinion." Warren took a deliberate step forward, his boots crunching in the snow. "You don't need his money, Christine. Not this way." A bitter, humorless laugh escaped her lips. "That's easy for you to say. You're not the one about to lose everything." He didn't even blink. "There's always another way." Arlie scoffed loudly. "Oh, spare us the sermon! You think the bank is just going to forgive her debts? You think her sister's school is going to take good intentions as payment?" Christine took a slow, deep breath. This was her problem, her decision, her burden to carry. But Warren's gaze held her. There was something in it, a silent plea, a warning, and beneath it all, a quiet, stubborn belief that she was still the girl he used to know. The girl who wouldn't do this. She turned back to Arlie, her voice cold and steady. "Tell Baird I'll think about it." Arlie's face split into a triumphant grin. He'd won. "That's my girl," he said. He tipped his hat, a mocking gesture, and sauntered back to his horse, whistling a jaunty tune as he rode away. Christine didn't watch him go. She turned to face Warren, bracing herself for the lecture, for the anger, but it never came. He just looked at her and slowly shook his head. It wasn't anger. It wasn't judgment. It was a quiet, profound sadness that cut her deeper than any harsh word could have. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back into the trees, disappearing as silently as he had arrived. Christine sat alone on her horse as the first snowflakes of a new storm began to fall, settling on her shoulders like a shroud. She had told herself her whole life that she would never stoop to this, that she had a line she would never cross. But tonight, standing on the edge of desperation, that line was starting to look awfully blurry. Sometimes right and wrong are just words, and when you're desperate enough, even the darkest path can start to look like the only way home. By the time Christine rode toward Charcoal Cave, the sky was a bruised, angry purple. Snowflakes no longer drifted. They flew sideways, driven by a wind that bit and tore at her clothes. This was foolish. She should have waited. She should have turned back and found another way. But Janet's letter was a burning coal in her pocket, and Christine Nelson was not a woman who knew how to turn back. The wind was a physical force, a malevolent presence trying to shove her horse off the narrow trail. Her mare tossed its head, whinnying in protest, its steps uncertain. "Easy, girl," Christine murmured, her own voice tight. "Just a little farther." The path ahead was a swirling vortex of snow and shadow. She'd ridden this way 100 times as a girl, exploring the foothills with Warren. She knew every rock, every twist, every treacherous dip, or so she thought. And then, the ground simply wasn't there anymore. The mare's hind legs slid out from under it on a patch of hidden ice. A strangled cry escaped Christine's lips as the world pitched sideways. She lost her grip on the reins, her body twisting in midair. She hit the ground hard. The impact was a starburst of pain that shot up her side, stealing the breath from her lungs. For a long, dizzying moment, she just lay there, the snow cold against her cheek, staring up at the chaotic sky. Her horse scrambled to its feet nearby, snorting nervously. Christine took a slow, ragged breath, then another. She pushed herself up, a groan escaping her lips as pain flared in her ribs. Nothing broken, but the cold was a patient killer. If she stayed down, she would die here. Wincing, she grabbed the reins and hauled herself to her feet, leaning against the trembling horse for support. She had to keep moving. As she brushed the snow from her coat, her numb fingers found the letter. She pulled it out. The paper was stiff with cold. She didn't need to read the words. They were etched on her soul. I don't want to be a burden. She swallowed against the lump in her throat. She was doing this for Janet. That's what she kept telling herself. But was it the whole truth? Or was she also running from something? From the ghost on her porch? From the whispers in town? From the doubt that was eating her alive? The wind shrieked through the pines, and for a second it sounded like a voice. A memory. It was years ago. A warm summer evening, the sky streaked with orange and pink. She was standing with her father by the barn, watching the sun bleed below the horizon. He was a quiet man, her father, but that night he had spoken. A person's got to know what kind of weight they're willing to carry, Christine. She'd looked up at his weathered face. What if the weight ain't fair? He'd let out a long, slow sigh. Fair ain't got much to do with it. The world puts the weight on your back whether you want it or not. He looked down at her then, his eyes serious. You just gotta decide what's worth carrying. Christine blinked, the memory vanishing into the swirling snow. The cold was a physical thing, pressing in on her, trying to find a way inside. She could still go back. She could still say no. But the image of Janet, forced to come home to this life of struggle. She couldn't bear it. She wasn't just carrying debt. She was carrying her sister's future on her shoulders. Gritting her teeth against the pain in her side, she pulled herself back into the saddle. The storm raged, clawing at her, daring her to continue. She kicked the horse forward, onward, into the teeth of the storm, toward the cave, toward a man she should despise, toward a choice that would change everything. Some storms you can outrun. Others you have to ride straight into. And Christine was about to find out just how strong this one was. The foothills near Charcoal Cave were a different world. The wind, which had been a raging beast on the plains, was quieter here, muffled by the dense stands of pine and the looming cliffs. A heavy, unnatural silence had fallen. The fresh snow was a perfect, unbroken sheet, swallowing all sound, hiding all tracks. No one would know she'd come this way. And if something went wrong, no one would ever find her. The entrance to the cave was a dark slash in the rock face, tucked beneath a jagged overhang. A faint, flickering orange glow emanated from within. Firelight, and carried on the still air, the low murmur of voices. She reined in her horse, dismounting behind a thicket of snow-laden trees. The mare was a liability now. A single nervous whinny would give her away. She gave the horse a final pat, her hand brushing against the cold leather of the revolver holstered at her hip. One deep breath in, another one out. There was no turning back now. She moved like a shadow, her boots sinking silently into the deep powder. As she drew closer, the figures became clearer. Two men huddled just inside the cave's mouth, seeking shelter from the cold. Crow Baird's men. One was leaning against the rock wall, gnawing on a piece of jerky. The other paced back and forth, his rifle held loosely in his hands. They were careless, complacent. They weren't expecting company. That was her only advantage. Her eyes darted around, assessing the terrain. The entrance was a bottleneck. No way around them. She'd have to go past them. They were just inside, their attention focused on the fire deeper in the cave. There was a narrow band of deep shadow along the opposite rock wall. It was risky, but it was the only way. Christine took a deep, steadying breath, and she moved. She kept low, her body pressed against the cold stone, a ghost in the twilight. Each step was slow, deliberate, her senses on fire. The fresh snow muffled her footsteps perfectly. She was almost past them, almost safe. and then her boot scraped against a loose piece of gravel hidden beneath the snow. The sound was small, but in the profound silence, it was as loud as a gunshot. Her blood ran cold. One of the men went rigid. He turned his head sharply, his eyes peering into the darkness where she stood frozen. "You hear that?" The other man spat on the ground. "Hear what?" "Sounded like something." The first man took a cautious step out of the cave, his hand tightening on his own pistol. Christine flattened herself against the rock, trying to will herself invisible. Her hand crept to the butt of her revolver. If he saw her, there would be no choice. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the silence. The man squinted, his eyes scanning the shadows. He took another step. Then, as if on cue, a sudden gust of wind swept down from the cliffs, rattling the branches of the pines and sending a shower of snow cascading from the overhang. The man flinched. He glanced back at his partner, who just shrugged. "Just the damn wind," the second man grumbled. "Now get back in here before you freeze your ears off." Christine didn't hesitate. In that split second of distraction, she slipped past the entrance and melted into the deeper shadows of the cave. She moved deeper inside, her eyes adjusting to the gloom. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and something else, something coppery and metallic. The smell of blood. The flickering fire cast distorted, dancing shadows on the damp stone walls. And there, just past the firelight, was the devil himself. Crow Baird was waiting. Getting in was the easy part. But now, as she stepped out of the shadows and into the light, Christine Nelson was about to discover what she had truly come here for, and it had nothing to do with money. The fire spit and crackled, the only lively thing in the oppressive gloom of the cave. The light played across Crow Baird's face, carving deep shadows into his sunken cheeks. He was slumped against the cave wall, a pile of dirty blankets wrapped around him, his skin a waxy, unnatural white. His breathing was shallow and ragged. He was hurt badly, maybe dying. And yet, when his eyes met hers, he smiled. It was a slow, predatory grin that didn't reach his pain-filled eyes. "Well, well," he rasped, his voice a dry rustle of dead leaves. "Look what the wind dragged in." Christine said nothing. She took a slow, deliberate step forward, her boots silent on the packed earth floor. Her eyes swept the small, miserable space. His gaze followed hers, gleaming with a feverish intensity. "Took you long enough," he wheezed. "Was starting to think you'd grown a conscience." Her fingers twitched. "You don't know the first thing about me." A rough, broken sound that might have been a laugh escaped his lips. "Oh, I know plenty." He gestured with a weak, trembling hand toward a leather pouch lying beside him. It was stuffed thick. The money. The reason she was supposed to be here. "Go on, then," he said, his eyes mocking her. "It's what you came for. Take it." Christine didn't move. Her feet felt rooted to the ground. Crow tilted his head, studying her like a curious snake. "Or is that not why you're here?" he whispered, his voice sharp with a sudden, knowing cruelty. Her pulse throbbed in her ears. This was the moment. She could take the money. She could do the bare minimum to keep him from bleeding out, and then walk away. She could save Janet. She could save herself. She could tell herself it was just business, but she couldn't move. A real smirk, full of genuine amusement, touched Crow's lips. "You think it makes you better, don't you?" he murmured. "Taking my money, but pretending you're above it. Above me." Her jaw tightened until it ached. "I am better than you." His smirk widened. "Yeah?" He coughed, a wet, rattling sound. "That what you tell yourself at night? Does it keep you warm?" His voice dropped, becoming a venomous whisper. "Because from where I'm sitting, you don't look so sure of yourself anymore, Christine." She took another step, her hands balling into tight fists at her sides. "I told you, she said, her voice low and dangerous. You don't know anything about me? He held her gaze, his eyes burning with fever and malice. I know you're here, he said. I know you're looking at that pouch of money and trying to decide if your precious pride is worth more than your sister's future. His voice softened, becoming horribly gentle. It's all right. I ain't gonna judge you. Her chest felt tight, like a band was constricting around it. I don't need your judgment. Good. Crow's lips curled into a grin. And then, as she finally reached for the pouch, he delivered the final fatal blow. You know, he murmured, his voice conversational. Your old man had that same look on his face. Right before I put a bullet in him. The fire crackled. The wind whispered at the mouth of the cave, but inside there was only a dead, roaring silence. Christine's breath stopped. Her heart stopped. And Crow Baird just smiled. Everything inside Christine went cold and still. The fire, the cave, the world outside. It all vanished, replaced by a white-hot, silent rage. Crow must have seen the change in her, the sudden, terrifying emptiness in her eyes, because his smirk faltered for the first time. What? He rasped, trying to regain his mocking tone. You think I was going to take that secret to the grave with me? He tried to push himself up, his voice gaining a ragged strength. That was always your problem, Christine, just like your old man. Too proud. Never knew when to just walk away. Before she even knew she was moving, her hand shot out. She didn't grab her gun. She grabbed the pouch of money, and with a strength she didn't know she possessed, she hurled it straight into the heart of the fire. The leather sizzled and smoked, and then the pouch burst open. The flames leaped up, a hungry orange maw devouring the bills, turning them to black, fluttering ash in seconds. Crow's smile vanished completely. For the first time, raw, primal fear flashed in his dark eyes. You just made a mistake, he stammered, his voice cracking. Christine stood over him, a righteous fury burning in her eyes, eclipsing everything else. No, she said, her voice deathly calm. I just fixed one. She had come to this cave seeking a deal with the devil. But now, watching the last of the blood money turn to ash, she knew what she was leaving with. The truth. And in a world built on lies, the truth was the most dangerous weapon of all. She didn't run from the cave. She was expelled from it, staggering out into the biting wind as if shot from a cannon. Her breath came in ragged, tearing gasps. The cold was a physical shock, but the storm inside her was a roaring inferno. Crow Baird killed her father. Not Warren, not Warren. And for 5 years, she had hated the wrong man. She had hated the only man who had ever looked at her like she was the sun. The realization was a physical agony, a knife twisting in her gut. She fumbled for her horse's reins, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold on. She swung herself into the saddle and kicked the horse into a frantic gallop, riding blindly into the swirling snow. She didn't know where she was going. She didn't care. All she could see was her father's face, Warren's face. The way the town had turned on him, their whispers like stones. The way she had stood by and let them. The way she had believed them. Because it was easier. It was easier to hate him than to face the terrifying possibility that everyone, including her, was wrong. The wind tore at her, trying to rip her from the saddle, but she rode harder, leaning low over the horse's neck. She had to find him. She had to tell him. She had to try and undo the impossible knot of the last 5 years. By the time she reached the ridge overlooking the town, her horse was slick with sweat and foam, its sides heaving. And through the curtain of falling snow, she saw him. Warren. He was standing by his horse, checking the saddle, preparing to ride out, to leave. Again. Because of her. A cry tore from her throat. She didn't think. She just reacted. She threw herself from the saddle and ran, stumbling through the deep snow, his name a raw prayer on her lips. Warren! He turned, his body going still. The snow clung to his hat, his coat, his eyelashes, but his eyes, those steady gray eyes, were fixed on her. She finally skidded to a halt in front of him, breathless and shaking, her lungs on fire. For a long moment, there was only the sound of her own ragged breathing and the whisper of the falling snow. Then he let out a long, slow sigh. "I told you not to go," he said, his voice quiet, heavy with a sorrow that was almost too much to bear. She swallowed, her throat raw. "I was wrong," she whispered, the words barely audible. He just looked at her, his expression unreadable. She took a step closer, her boots sinking deep. "Crowbaird," she said, the name tasting like ash. He confessed. He killed my father." Warren didn't react. He didn't look surprised. He just watched her, his face a stoic mask. "All these years," she choked out, her voice breaking. I was wrong about you." Warren's jaw tightened. He looked down at the snow for a moment, then back at her. And so softly she almost thought the wind had imagined it, he said, "I know." The words hit her harder than a physical blow. "You knew." He finally looked away, his gaze fixed on the distant, snow-shrouded mountains. "I knew Crow killed your father," he said, his voice flat. "But knowing the truth and proving it, they ain't the same thing." A bitter, mirthless sound escaped his lips. "And after a while, I figured it didn't matter anymore. You'd already made up your mind about me." Her stomach twisted into a knot of shame and regret. He was right. She had. She had chosen anger because it was easier than grief. She had chosen the lie because the truth was too complicated. And her choice had cost them everything. The wind howled, a lonely, desolate sound that mirrored the emptiness inside her. She took another step, then another, until she was standing right in front of him. "I should have known," she whispered, her voice cracking completely. "I should have—" The words wouldn't come. There were no words for this kind of failure. And before she could stop herself, before her pride could reassert itself, she collapsed. Her body sagged against his, her hands grabbing fistfuls of his rough coat, her forehead pressing into his chest as a wave of trembling shook her from head to toe. For a terrifying second, he remained perfectly still, a man carved from stone. Then, slowly, hesitantly, his arms came around her, pulling her close. She squeezed her eyes shut, the rough wool of his coat scratching her cheek. 5 years. 5 years of hate. 5 years of anger that had been a shield, protecting her from this very moment, from this unbearable truth. But the shield had shattered. And now, there was nothing left to do but fall. She had never cried for her father. Not really. She had buried the grief under a mountain of rage and responsibility. But now, held in the arms of the man she had wronged so deeply, the dam finally broke. A deep, shuddering sob tore through her, muffled against his chest. Her hands clenched tighter, holding on to him as if he were the only solid thing in a world that had just dissolved around her. He didn't speak. He just held her. He let her break. He let the poison of the last 5 years pour out of her. He let her be human. She tried to say his name, to apologize, to explain, but all that came out was a broken sound. His arms tightened almost imperceptibly. "You don't have to," he said softly, his voice a low rumble in his chest. And she stilled. She didn't have to. For the first time in 5 years, she didn't have to be strong. She didn't have to carry it all alone. The realization was so profound, it was like taking her first breath after nearly drowning. She let out another shaky, uneven breath, and he just held her, a silent, steady presence in the heart of the storm. They stood like that for a long time, 2 solitary figures against a backdrop of white, the world around them ceasing to exist. Finally, he spoke again. his voice still quiet but firm. "You're not alone, Christine." It wasn't a promise for the future. It wasn't a question. It was a simple statement of fact. A truth she had fought against for so long. A truth she no longer had the strength or the desire to deny. She finally lifted her head. Her face was a mess, streaked with tears and snow, but she didn't try to hide it. Not from him. He looked down at her, his gray eyes searching hers, waiting. And for the first time since that summer day in the meadow, she let him see all the way in. She took a slow, shaky breath, and then, at long last, she nodded. A silent surrender. A silent apology. A silent beginning. Forgiveness was a distant country, and healing was a journey she couldn't yet imagine. But as Christine stood there in the falling snow, her hand finding its way into his, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She wasn't walking this road alone anymore. Christine and Warren have finally found their way back to the truth, but Crow Baird is still out there. And a confession in a cave isn't justice. Can they expose the truth to a town that condemned an innocent man? And is forgiveness enough to build a future on the ashes of the past? Let us know what you think should happen next in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales from the forgotten pages of history.